Hello, and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 2025. The topic is Q&A, and the title is Poor Exercise Selection Holding You Back? One of my clients is a personal trainer. We've been working together since the start of the year, and they've made great progress. She's very happy. She's more muscular, she's leaner, she's feeling more mobile and stronger. That's everything that she wanted. So I'm happy about that. And in a recent journal entry, she wrote the following. I wanted to ask a question, but first I want to preface by saying I am 100% happy with the service. So usually, like, a little insight on me is like when somebody starts that, you're like, oh, crap. Because usually there's something good before a bad thing. But she wrote, I want to preface by saying I'm 100% happy with the service and with the results I'm seeing. I listen to your podcast almost daily and have learned a lot through this process. I feel as though I'm the best I have ever been physically and mentally. Well, that's awesome. Love that. Very happy. With that said, haha, she actually wrote haha. Everything we're doing seems very simple, but yet I'm getting results beyond what I've been able to achieve previously on my own. That's awesome. I look at our nutrition and it's just calories, protein, timing, and general food choice considerations. Nothing new, nothing fancy. I look at our training and it's just lower upper splits with a fun day Friday where we do fun athletic things. But again, nothing new, nothing fancy. I can't see where in our programming that stands out as the reason for the drastic progress. I mean this in the nicest way possible. Why is this working so well? Well, that's awesome. So very, very happy about that. So really cool. So number one, happy she's getting results. Number two, happy she's learning through the process. That is definitely one of my goals, is not only help people achieve their goals, but to learn something that they can improve the rest of their life with. You know, have something that's a takeaway from this that they can use for themselves. And especially the clients who are personal trainers, I want them to know and learn things that they can use for their clients. But getting to the question of why is this working so well? Awesome question. Absolutely love that. I also actually like, this is going to sound maybe funny, but I like that she wrote nothing new, nothing fancy twice. So in regards to our nutrition, she said it's nothing new, nothing fancy. In regards to our training, it's nothing new, nothing fancy. I actually kind of like that because it's often people make it out to be more than it is in regards to what will help them make progress. People want it to be something special because then if you're not achieving progress, it's a more of a valid reason in our mind. Is if the way to make progress is very complicated, complex, and challenging, then it makes sense and it's totally okay if I'm not making progress. But I like it to be nothing new and nothing fancy, quote unquote, because it destigmatizes progress and it makes the process seem more obtainable, which I actually like. That can reduce the ability to excuse it away when you're not making progress, but I like that it can actually be motivational to making progress, knowing that it's nothing new, nothing fancy. So awesome. Very happy she wrote that. Now, my answer to her was, why is this working? So when she wrote the question, why is this working so well? I said, first of all, you're overall consistent. Your consistency is fantastic. She does a great job with her nutrition. She hits her nutrition goals 5 out of 7 days all the time. Typically, she'll go 4 weeks and maybe only miss 2 to 3 days where she missed her calories or her protein. Everything's pretty consistent there. And then training, I don't know when in the last 5 months and 3 weeks if she's missed any training. Now, that has been a change of training. Like she went, I forget when it was, but it was like, I think late February, early March or something. She went on a vacation, and so she did like some jogs and some bodyweight squats and stuff for her workouts that week, but she still worked out. So when we say consistent with training, it doesn't have to be that it's always the program. Every single workout has to be on the program or it's a failure. That's not a healthy way to look at things. It's not even possible long term. So she just was able to move. She was able to stay active, and that's what we mean by being consistent. So I congratulated her on her overall consistency, and I wanted to make that the first point because that is what matters most. You can have the best diet, you can have the best training program, but if you're not doing them, you're not going to get the results from them. I've actually talked about that in the past couple podcasts. We were talking about, podcast number literally yesterday, so 2024, and in podcast 2023, I talked about how some clients are currently struggling with their goals to make better progress because they're consistent less than half the days. They're not even hitting their nutrition targets 50% of the time. So of course you're not going to make great progress if you're not even doing, any program, good or bad, only half the time. So she's doing a great job there. And then her nutritional consistency, and I mentioned that she's very consistent, only 2 to 3 days missed in 4 weeks. But what I also wrote to her, and what I'd like to point out, is that she's been consistent with her kind of focus. Whenever her and I started talking at the beginning of the new year, what happened was she would want to build muscle, so she would go into a caloric surplus. She would build some muscle, but she'd feel thick and bulky and didn't like that feeling. She would then talk herself into doing a calorie deficit, like a calorie cut. She would then feel leaner, get rid of some of that bulk, but then she's like, well, I'm not going to grow if I'm in a calorie deficit. So she would always talk herself out of one back into the other, then back into the other. And what happened was she was believing that in order for her to grow, she had to be in a caloric surplus that was of a notable surplus that it caused body fat gain. What we did was I refined her calories and her protein. We increased her protein to about 1/3 of her total calories. And then from there, the calories we spread out, but we actually front-loaded the day. She has the majority of her calories, probably roughly, if I had to estimate, in meaning I know what it is on paper, but what it is actually in reality. In reality, she's having about 60% of her calories in the first 50% of the day. So she's front-loading her day and eating a little bit less in the evenings, and that's helping her have higher activity, higher energy during her higher active times during the day. That's giving her great energy, good mood, great killer workouts. She's training her clients really well. She feels good. And then as the day fades, she eats less, and then that helps her not store as much body fat. When her activity is going down, her food is going down. So when she would typically have been in a big deficit during the day, then a surplus in the evening, and she was in a overall surplus, not a good recipe, definitely going to gain a bunch of body fat. So what we have her now is she's probably eating around maintenance of her calories, maybe a smidge over, but her protein is really high and the distribution is better. So this is allowing her to have more food coming in when she's active, have less carbs and fats coming in when she's less active, but her protein is still high in the evenings. This is allowing her to burn off body fat and not store it coming into the evenings, but still have protein available for muscle growth. So essentially what we're doing is we're feeding her just the energy she needs, just the carbs and fats that she needs, not really much of a surplus there, but the protein is a surplus definitely compared to where she's been. And right now it's roughly about 1 gram per pound of body weight for her. And some days she goes a little bit more, but that's about where we're at. And that's helping. That's bumped her protein up from where it was before. Her carbs and fats are better distributed to match her activity level. So she's overall getting more muscle, but she's feeling leaner as she's building more muscle. And she's seeing the strength increase, which is definitely a neurological adaptation to the training plus technique improvement, but also that is going to come from proper nutrition as well. So we did make some nutritional changes from what she was doing before, and that 100% is contributing to the better progress. So those are the two big things. Overall consistency, and then nutritional consistency, not only with adherence to the goals, but staying within a focus long enough to actually get what you want from it. And then, number 3, is the training specificity. Her programming, we are having proper now regulation of intensity and volume and correct exercise selection. Now, for that to matter, for training intensity and volume and exercise selection to matter, to really make a difference, you have to have those first two things in place. Is overall consistency of habits and then nutritional consistency and accuracy of what you're doing to your goals. So, with that said, when we look at the question of today's podcast, is poor exercise selection holding you back? For her, it was. The programming was messing her up. So, yeah, the nutrition was slightly off, for sure. But her training was more off. And if the training had been better, even with her nutrition being improper, she would have made better progress than she did before. Now, with the nutrition being on point, she's making great progress, hence why she's very happy, which is great. But I wanted to cover the previous programming mistakes that she was making. There were 3 large ones that I thought would be good for today's discussion. Number 1 was she was going too heavy too often. Number 2, she was misloading the movements, and I'll explain what that means in a second. And number 3, the exercises didn't target what she actually needed. So if we look at the first one, going too heavy too often. She was doing a max effort, not a 1 rep max, but a max intensity, meaning like a set of 5 to the point where like your back is breaking, everything's breaking down, technique is trash. Like she was getting destroyed in her her top end sets of squats. And she was doing the same thing for deadlift in the same week. So she was maxing out crazy intensity. Again, not a single rep max, but however many reps she was going for, it looked like she should have only done half of those because the second half of them, the technique was breaking down. It wasn't crisp and clean. It was just all-out failure, not good technique failure, not good form failure. It was like all-out failure. So she was doing that like Mondays on squats and then Thursdays on deadlift. That is too much, especially considering the fault that she has in squats dumps the weight to her lower back. So she once her quads fail, she ends up lifting the weight with her lower back very intensely. And that means she's maxing out her lower back's capacity and really fatiguing it on Monday, then doing the same damn thing on Thursday. And then she was doing that week after week after week after week. She came from the mindset that she had to kind of feel punished, feel thrashed, feel beat up in order to make progress. The downside is that wasn't true. She was just feeling beat up and she wasn't making great progress. So it may have gotten her to a point, but it wasn't getting her any further. And part of the reason why, when she was just starting, she was weak. Meaning that when you go to bad form failure, if you're going to bad form failure with 135, that's different than going to bad form failure with 225 or 275 or 315. So when she was starting, she could go to bad form failure and recover faster because the weight she was able to use wasn't very high. Now that she is squatting in the high 200s, low 300s, she can't do bad form failure anymore and then think that she's going to be fully recovered in 2 or 3 days. Hell no. And the same thing was happening with her deadlift. Was she was playing around with sumo deadlifts, which was actually, I'll talk about that in a second. It wasn't targeting what she needed. It was growing her upper outer glutes, not like the fullness of the glutes and the bottom of the glute, which she wanted for aesthetic reasons. So she was picking the wrong deadlift based on her anatomy. But again, she was killing her hips, killing her lower back, killing her upper back, her thoracic spinal muscles, just destroying herself. And when she was weaker, it didn't matter so much because the weight wasn't very much. But as she got stronger, it mattered more, but she never knew that. She never modified her training program to account for the increase in strength. So as she got stronger, she didn't adjust her training to account for that. And Overall, what she was doing with technique was there was very little. It was just, if I can move the weight, I'm going to keep going. And that is horrendous. That is absolutely bad for overall progress. You can get away with it as a newbie, as a beginner, but as you get to any level of intermediate type skill set, you can't just go to bad form failure with everything, especially not large compound movements like squats and deadlifts. You might see somebody take lying leg curls, and if they can't get a full repetition, maybe they do a couple partials, then they quit. And that would be technically like a bad rep because it wasn't the full range of motion. But it's on a machine, so it's guided. There was no other muscles really helping out. There was no spinal twisting. There wasn't a bunch of other things getting involved. And it wasn't a systemic breakdown. Whereas squats and deadlifts, if you start to have your knees cave in, your shoulders roll forward, and you look like you're dying in the middle of the rep, you're annihilating so many things. You're beating up joints, you're beating up other muscles. Your nervous system takes a bigger hit from a large movement taken to bad form failure, as opposed to a machine where everything's guided, everything's kind of protected, to where you can go to actually like bad form failure, and it's not as detrimental. It's not good in the grand scheme of things. Can it be used? Yes. Blah blah blah. But in general, if you do machines or isolated movements to partial rep failure, that is not as systemic damage as major compound free weight movements taken to bad form failure. So that was one of the things we changed, was she's not lifting as heavy as often, and we stop when the technique breaks down. So we started with a rule of 2 bad reps, the set ends. So I was telling her about like pretty reps and ugly reps. When everything looks like it's part of a tutorial video. Like if she sends me a set of 5, and I'm like, those first 3 reps, you could clip that and put that on YouTube as a tutorial video. Those are pretty. Perfect. Number 4, we kind of shifted forward into her toes, your shoulders rounded forward, and it didn't look pretty. That would not be one that we would want to show in a tutorial video, right? That isn't one you would show your clients on, this is how you squat. So that is an ugly rep. Our rule was, if you had 2 ugly reps, you had to stop. Meaning, maybe it was just a positional thing. Maybe on the next rep, she can come back and kind of reclaim good position and make it look pretty again. But then on the following rep, it breaks down again. So that's the second ugly rep, she has to quit. So we started that rule, and then I helped her with video reviews every week to identify, what do the pretty reps look like, what do the ugly ones look like? Because when you're first practicing that, you might look at something and be like, this is hideous. I'm like, that's actually really good. Don't beat yourself up so much. Or you have people on the other end of the spectrum where they'll send me a video and I think they all look great. And I'm like, good God. I'm like, the second half of the set all looked like you were going to die. So no. So we'll go through that and play that game of kind of learning to identify those. But that was the biggest thing we did, was changing the technique, and then having her where she's lifting heavy per week to develop strength. However, we're not going to like 100% intensity. So if you use like an RPE scale, a rate of perceived exertion, when people use that in powerlifting, they typically use a scale of 1 to 10, but nobody uses under 5. 5 means I'm moving, but it's not hard at all. 6 is I'm moving, still not that hard. 7, I'm moving, I can start to feel some challenge to it, but I'm definitely okay. 8 is I'm moving, this is definitely challenging. 9, I'm moving, this is super challenging, I'm starting to break down, and I don't know if the quality's that great. 10 is screw quality, I'm just seeing if I can drive this thing and get it moving, right? She was doing 10 to 10 to 10 to 10 all the time. What I have her doing now are like 7s and 8s. And once she learns 7s and 8s, and we've done 5 months of programming now. So we've played around with some conservative maxes where I let her, I was like, think of this as a 9. Don't go 10. Don't go 10 on me. But let's go to a 9. And let's see if we can ride the edge of good technique. So we've had fun playing with that, and that has definitely helped a lot. The second thing that we changed in our programming was the misloading of movements. We said that the main movements were too heavy. She was going too heavy with squats, deadlifts, She didn't do a lot of bench press. She did mostly like overhead presses. But in general, her upper body stuff was actually all pretty clean. The lower body stuff was way too heavy. Then, on contrast, her accessories were too light. She was doing movements that just were not heavy enough to damage things and cause significant progress. So one of her main movements she did for her back was an inverted row on the TRX system. And although that's a good movement, it's only body weight. So she was using that and considering that to be like a back builder, but it was just body weight. It's a challenging position, and it is hard to do for a lot of people. But that isn't going to cause sheer force damage to the tissue. That's not really going to damage and beat up and grow the tissue. That's a good developer of relative strength, meaning how strong you are at moving yourself, your body weight, but it's not a great developer for absolute strength. We want external weight load for absolute strength, and that's going to also create greater muscle damage, which gets a greater muscle growth. So we started doing things like cable-seated rows. She can do cable-seated row relatively heavy, whereas an inverted row, she was doing them super crisp and clean, but there was really no heaviness to it, so she wasn't getting a lot of development. She was also doing things like skull crushers for her triceps. She was doing a lot of arm isolative movements, and they were all relatively very light. So it's not going to create a lot of like tissue damage because a lot of those movements were too light to be useful. Another example would be after squats. After deadlifts, she had a workout where she did sumo deadlifts, but then did a bunch of variations of glute bridges and then bodyweight walking lunges. And it was just not enough. Like, where's the tissue damage? The deadlifts were so damn heavy and ugly looking that she then shifted immediately to bodyweight things, and there was just nothing in between. There was no weighted things in between there. So we cleaned up the technique on the deadlifts, and now we would do things like weighted walking lunges, like dumbbell walking lunges, whether it's hang hold or goblet hold. We'll do weighted step ups, do GHR raises like glute raises and things like that. But there's got to be some weighted movements in the middle now. And that was a big thing for her, is the main lifts were too heavy, the accessories were too light. Then the third thing was the exercises didn't target what she needed. So for quad development and to help develop her squat, she would squat. It would look, crazy and like too much. Then she would do things where, again, like walking lunges, she would do variations of like body weight squats. She might do like a kettlebell swing, which is actually a hinge movement, not a quad movement. So her squat is going to develop more as she would develop her quads. And a lot of the stuff that she was doing was either a hinge movement, or it wasn't heavy enough to be quads, or it wasn't like quad isolative enough. So one of the things I introduced her to, and any of my clients who've done zombie squats will immediately go, oh gosh, yeah. But we did zombie squats after her barbell squats. And that is a variation of a front squat that you really can't cheat. You can't get your lower back involved. You can't basically cheat the position too much because you'll drop the bar. So a zombie squat is something that is more specific to the movement pattern that we need to emphasize and build our squat, but also isolates the quadriceps better. We're also doing like a goblet hold walking lunges, goblet hold step-ups. That's a much more uprighted torso position, and that forces more muscle involvement down by the knee of the quadriceps. So before, she was doing things where it was so heavy that she had to hinge a lot. So she would, her torso would change angles, and she'd have to be bent over too much in the bottom or the stretched position of the movements. So we had to switch over to exercises where her torso could stay more upright throughout the entire range of motion, and that would actually better develop her quadriceps. Same thing with glutes. She was doing too many things that involved too many other muscles, the hamstrings taking over or misloading of the top end. So for example, she was doing barbell RDLs, And the coach she was with before had her lower the bar down to her knee and then stand back up. So it was kind of like a partial RDL. But that's mostly going to be the upper glutes, and it's going to be a lot of just lower back support. It's not a full range of motion for the glutes, and in the top few inches of an RDL, you're not really loading the glutes much because the weight is actually against gravity, whereas the glutes are kind of pulling the torso up. So as the torso is more and more upright, the glutes are less and less of a workload. And with that short-ranged RDL, that's almost all uprighted torso, so very minimal glute work. It was something she could do very heavy, which I believe the trainer probably thought, well, if I can progress her weight load, then I can grow her muscles. The downside is the weight load was progressing, but using other muscles. So we needed to better isolate the glutes, but we still need to have a decent weight load on the glutes. So we've actually been doing partial RDLs where we do the mid-range of motion. She never locks out. She never fully stretches to the bottom. We keep it all in the glutes there. Another term is like a Dimmel deadlift, but you're doing it slow, not explosive. We are also doing weighted 45-degree hyperextensions, weighted glute raises on a GHD. We're doing a lot of variations of things now where the most stretched the glutes are doesn't overstretch to where the hamstrings take over, but it's maximally loaded in that stretch position, but we still keep a maximal load in glutes at the top. So think of a 45-degree hyperextension, and we actually slide a 25-pound plate under the back end of her machine. The machine has a very heavy base, so it doesn't flip. We don't have to worry about that. But she gets on there, and she'll hold like a 45-pound plate, and she does sets of 10 to 14 reps now. And at the lockout position, the torso is not upright at all. It's at, a typical 45-degree hyperextension would be 45 degrees. Hers is a little bit more shallow because we raise the back end. But that's going to keep the glutes more loaded in that locked out position, but they're still maximally loaded as well in the bottom position. So we're using a part of the range of motion that we don't lose the load stimulus at either end of the movement. And that's new for her, and it's definitely helping a lot. For shoulder development, she was just doing presses. Her trainer never had her do lateral raises. I can't believe that. And I was like, have you ever had a shoulder injury? And she's like, no. And I said, what? So she's never had a shoulder injury, but the trainer never had her do lateral raises. I have no clue why. She loves lateral raises, and her shoulders are taken off. They're looking great now. So I have no clue. I mean, maybe that, obviously I'm assuming the trainer never did them on his own. So he probably never did lateral raises, so he didn't bother programming lateral raises for her. But that's not a good sign. Just because you do or don't do things doesn't mean that's what your clients should or shouldn't do. In the sense that if he was a powerlifter background and he didn't do lateral raises because he was a powerlifter, he's working with a client who is not a powerlifter. She doesn't want to be a powerlifter. She has no goal of being a powerlifter. So her exercise selection should be based on powerlifting if she's not a powerlifter. So I don't really know why she never did raises, but why the trainer never gave her raises, I don't know. So who knows? But she's doing better now. And then back development, all I hinted around at that was some of the movements were too light and or too heavy. So one of the combinations she had barbell bent over rows, T-bar rows, which are going to involve a lot of lower back work. And then she would also have the inverted rows on the TRX. And it's like, well, then that's very minimal loaded. And it's the hardest position is the most contracted position, which is the least beneficial position for stretch overload, like for growth. So it's a horrible pairing. Like to do T-bar rows and then an inverted row is not great for back growth. If she really just wants isolated back growth, she wouldn't have wanted her lower back to be overly developed. There was no, I don't know. It's just an odd pairing to do T-bar rows supersetted with inverted row. It's an odd pairing for her goals. So we've changed that, and now we do like cable seated rows. We'll do pull-up variations. We do things to where the lower back doesn't have to support the entire movement, and we get a maximal load in the stretched position, as well as any less of the range of motion. We want the stretch position to be loaded as much, if not more so, than the contracted position. And the previous program had her doing the opposite of that. So not helpful at all. So these are the things we cleaned up, in a sense that her exercise selection was definitely holding her back, 100%. But so was misloaded movements, which is partially related to exercise selection, and then being too heavy too often with her main movements, which can also be related to exercise selection as well. If somebody likes to kill themselves in training, you give them underloaded variations. So you make them max out on a front squat, not a back squat, that kind of thing. You give them variations to where even at max intensity, they can't use the weight load as they would typically use in a normal variation of that lift. So you give them underloaded variations. So that, again, is exercise selection. So exercise selection absolutely 100% can hinder progress. It doesn't matter as much if you're not consistent and if you don't have proper nutritional support. So you have to have those things in place as well. And I would say that those have to be first. Then exercise selection matters a lot. So I thought it would be fun to hear her story specifically about how exercise selection, poor exercise selection was contributing to her not making progress. So if we go back to her question is, why is this working so well? She's consistent overall with nutrition and training. Her nutrition is a consistent setup now. She's not yo-yoing back and forth. And her training has much better exercise selection, which is also helping to control intensity and volume regulation. Awesome. So I thought that was helpful. If you have any questions, if you need anything, reach out on our website. The website is www.brutalirongym.com. You can check out our one-on-one services page if you want to be trained by me and have me help you with nutrition and training, and you can get great programming that has all the proper exercise selection. You can learn about that on the website. And then we also have other services and a lot of free information as well. I hope that you always reach out. On the bottom of the homepage is a contact form. You can send me a message anytime you want, whether it's regards to training services or the podcast, if you have any suggestions or questions. Awesome. If you like the podcast, please share the podcast. The more people we share it with, the more people we can help. Also, if you like the podcast, please consider donating to support the podcast, which you can do on the website. And if you like the information we share in the podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels. You can find us and follow us on Instagram and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.